The wounds are yet to heal.
Everybody get off the middle of this LZ. Everybody move out. Get out there.
Distant now, the memories refuse to fade.
4-6, get that mortar set up on the hill. I want fire in 1 minute.
The lessons ignored at America's peril. Vietnam, that third-rate war that brought the world's greatest power to its knees.
What do you think about this Vietnam thing?
It's the damn worst mess I ever saw, and I knew we were going to get in this sort of mess when we went in there, and I don't see how we're going to ever get out.
Images and sounds that still cast a shadow across a nation's soul.
I don't see what we can ever hope to get out of there with once we're committed. I don't think it's worth fighting for, and I don't think we can get out.
A policy orphaned in defeat that had seemed 15 years earlier to capture the spirit of America.
Let every nation know, whether it wishes us well or ill, that we shall pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe, to assure the survival and the success of liberty.
And what a price. 58,000 American lives, hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese. It was a course charted by Presidents Eisenhower and Kennedy, but it quickly became known as Lyndon Johnson's War. But this was a reluctant warrior, from the outset riddled with doubts over the wisdom of his campaign to contain communist expansion. Now, 35 years later, we can join the president's deliberations. Johnson left behind an unprecedented record of his private discussions with senior staff. Intimate and revealing telephone conversations, secretly recorded on a Dictabelt machine, now released. We have recreated some of the scenes that follow, but the voices you hear are those of Lyndon Johnson and his closest advisors as they debated the wisdom of a policy that would take them into war.
Just stayed awake last night thinking about this thing. The more I think of it, I don't know what in the hell. It looks like me we're getting into another Korea. It just worries the hell out of me. I don't see what we can ever hope to get out of there with once we're committed. And it's just the biggest damn mess I ever saw.
It's an awful mess.
Given those doubts, why did Lyndon Johnson take America into a full-scale ground war in July 1965? Did he have a choice? And what did the best and brightest tell the president about the threat America faced in Southeast Asia? Only LBJ knew the whole story. But now, for the first time, we can judge for ourselves, eavesdrop on history in the making. Listen to moments of candor and deception, anguish and bombast, conversations recorded in the eye of the storm. November 1963. John F. Kennedy was gone. With him, the dreams of his new frontier. A president gunned down in Dallas, killed just a year after America and the Soviet Union stood eyeball to eyeball over missiles in Cuba. To the new president, the sheer enormity of the crime suggested a connection.
I thought the most important thing in the world was to decide who was president of this country at that moment. I was fearful that the communists were trying to take us over. What raced through my mind was that if they had shot our president driving down there, who would they shoot next? And what was going on in Washington? And when would the missiles be coming? And I thought that it was a conspiracy, and I raised that question. And nearly everybody that was with me raised it.
The Vietnam War was fought against the backdrop of the Cold War, a time of superpower confrontation, a time when world peace was maintained by the threat that both the Soviet Union and the United States could destroy each other and wipe out human existence.
Mr. Speaker, the President of the United States.
Johnson masterfully guided the nation through the tragedy of Kennedy's death. he assured the country that his administration would be committed to continuing the fallen leader's journey.
On the 20th day of January in 1961, John F. Kennedy told his countrymen, "Let us begin." Today, in this moment of new resolve, I would say to all my fellow Americans, let us continue.
But what did that mean for Vietnam? As America mourned, South Vietnam was in an uproar. In Saigon, mobs had taken to the streets in the wake of the assassination of their own president just 3 weeks earlier. The death of President Diem resulted from a military coup instigated by the Kennedy administration. It had been an American hope that Diem's removal would turn the tide of the war against the Viet Cong. It was a tragic miscalculation. Instead of being energized to fight the communist enemy, South Vietnam had descended into anarchy. It was left to Lyndon Johnson to pick up the pieces. He'd opposed the coup, but had been ignored. What he knew for certain was that Vietnam was not the war he wanted to fight. In the early spring of 1964, the new president told his mentor, Senator Richard Russell, that he feared the commitment would lead to disaster.
You, Mr. President. Oh, I'm got lots of trouble. I want to see what we all have those. What do you think about this Vietnam thing? What I'd like to hear you talk a little bit. It's the damn worst mess I ever saw, and I don't like to brag. I never have been right many times in my life, but I knew we were going to get in this sort of mess when we went in there, and I don't see how we're going to ever get out without fighting a major war with the Chinese and all of them down there in those rice paddies and jungles. I just don't know what to do. Our position is deteriorating, and it looks like the more we try to do for them, the less they're willing to do for themselves. It's a mess. I don't think the American people were quite ready for us to send our troops in there to do the fighting. If it got down to that or just pulling out, I'd get out. How important is it to us? It isn't important a damn bit. We're just getting the quicksands up to our very neck. Well, it'd impeach the president, though, that'd run out, wouldn't it? And I don't know how in the hell you're going to get out unless they tell you to get out. I tell you, it'll be the most expensive venture this country ever went into. I love you, and I'll be calling you. I'll see you soon.
So Johnson feared impeachment, not as a result of getting into the fight, but rather as a consequence of getting out. He told friends the country would never condone weakness, and that he felt trapped by both history and the political calendar. 1964 was an election year in America, and LBJ knew it would be political suicide to allow South Vietnam to fall to communism. He was also determined to keep the nation at peace, to allow time for the Congress to pass his own ambitious social agenda. Johnson was betting his presidency on managing a crisis over which he had virtually no control.
Mr. Bundy on line 1.
A master of the domestic scene, this president turned to men such as National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy to guide him through treacherous waters abroad.
What is your own internal thinking on this, Mr. President, that we've just got to stick on this middle course as long as there's any possible hope? And
I just can't believe that we can't take 15,000 advisors and maintain the status quo for 6 months. I just believe we can do that if we do it right. Now, I don't know enough about it to know.
So I don't.
I kind of had the impression that we hadn't been as active in guerrilla warfare on the ground as we were in the air.
I think this is right, Mr. President. I just don't think we do have enough people with a guerrilla and counter-guerrilla mentality in that process, and that means special forces, and it means really saying to Westmoreland very loud and very clear that that's the kind of war it is, being in there stiffening the troops, and then at the same time the track for touching up on the north in as sensitive and careful a way as we can get it.
That's right.
Aye, aye.
Okay.
Right.
Johnson was referring to the over 15,000 American soldiers already in Vietnam and the operations designed to carry the war into the North without leaving any traces that could lead back to Washington. The deception required because in the spring of 1964, these men were listed as advisors, not combatants. But under their new commanding general, William Westmoreland, the Americans were finding it hard to avoid being sucked into the battle. 260 had already lost their lives, and the enemy was gaining every day. A continuation of the status quo seemed certain to bring defeat. It was an outcome that particularly troubled one member of the Johnson team. Bobby Kennedy had stayed on at the Justice Department, but the mutual contempt the two men felt was the worst-kept secret in Washington. Bobby felt that Vietnam threatened to tarnish not only the incumbent's legacy, but also his brother's. He felt Johnson was increasingly listening to the generals and was being pushed into a war that would have disastrous consequences for America.
Yes?
The Attorney General, I know.
Loud, I can't hear you.
The Attorney General, I know.
All right. Take this, will you?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Well, Mr. President, I have not been involved intimately with on the Southeast Asia or Vietnam. Based on my two meetings at the National Security Council meeting, I thought that there was too much emphasis really on the military aspects of it. I would think that war will never be won militarily. But where it's going to be won really is a political war. That they're dropping a bomb someplace or sending more planes there. The people themselves aren't interested.
I think that that's good thinking, and that's not any different from the way I have felt about it. We're not ready to have a declaration of war or war by executive order. If you're going to be here, I wish you'd get in with Bundy when he gets back here. And
I didn't want to, put myself in there.
You put yourself in everything that you've ever been doing. You're wanted and needed, and we care, and we must have all the capacity we have and all the experience. And I wouldn't say that if I didn't mean that, and I don't need to say it, and I just to say much obliged and thank you if I didn't want it. I sincerely want it and genuinely want it, and they're never going to separate us as far as I'm concerned.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Bye, Bobby.
Thank you.
Bobby called his closest friend in the cabinet, Robert McNamara, to try and reverse what he saw as a headlong rush into war. McNamara only confirmed Kennedy's suspicions. The Attorney General then wrote to Johnson with a startling offer. He was willing to go to Saigon as the ambassador, a move he hoped would fraught the generals. But Johnson was not about to hand the conduct of the war to a man he privately described as an inexperienced little runt.
Yeah. And I know you so this line. Yes?
The Attorney General on line O.
I'm with some folks. I just wanted you to know that the nicest thing happened to me since I've been here is your note, and I appreciate it so very, very much. And I can't think of letting you do that, but you got to help me with who we do get, and we got to get him pretty soon. We'll talk about it in the next few hours, but I think we're in better shape than we've ever been when that letter come in, and I wanted you to know it. I'll sleep better tonight.
Thank you very much, Mr. President.
I appreciate it more than you'll ever know.
No, that's very nice.
Man, you're a great, great guy. You wouldn't write that kind of letter.
Thank you very much.
Goodbye.
Thanks, bye.
Instead of turning to doves, such as Bobby Kennedy, Johnson chose Maxwell Taylor, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Johnson wanted a four-star general, not a diplomat representing his interests in Saigon. He also felt the Pentagon should take the offensive. In April 1964, the president told his Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, that America was treaty-bound to defend South Vietnam, that her word was on the line, that Americans would never accept defeat.
Mine is here. Yes. Yes?
Mr. President, Secretary McNamara on 9-0.
Bob?
Yes, Mr. President.
I hate to bother you, but
No trouble at all.
tell me, have we got anybody that's got a military mind that can give us some military plans for winning that war? Well, let's get some more something, my friend, because I'm going to have a heart attack if you don't get me something. What I want is somebody that can lay up some plans to trap these guys and whip hell out of them. Kill some of them. That's what I want to do. If this Army Chief Staff's not going to do it, well, let's get somebody else that'll do it.
I'll try and bring something back that will meet that objective.
Give up. Thank you.
That was the Johnson style. He may not have wanted the fight, but he was used to winning and couldn't understand why America, for all its might, could be cowed by a peasant army. McNamara arrived in country in search of a winning strategy. He was told America and her ally were losing the war. A communist victory could come within weeks. He readily accepted a series of proposals that became known as Op Plan 34A, the use of South Vietnamese special forces under direct American control to launch counterattacks deep into North Vietnam. The operations would be funded by the U.S. military, the missions approved by President Johnson himself. They were described by McNamara as mere pinpricks. But as with so much of this war, it was these small, incremental steps that would have profound and disastrous results for America. July 31st, 1964. A PT boat left the South Vietnam harbor at Da Nang headed north. Its target, a North Vietnamese radar site on the island of Han My. The mission controlled by the U.S. but manned by South Vietnamese special forces. Out in the Gulf of Tonkin, the USS Maddox was steaming towards the same location on an intelligence gathering mission. Both these operations, part of the Op Plan 34A strategy, developed to reverse the course of the conflict. Two of McNamara's small pinpricks in an undeclared war few Americans knew was even being fought. After firing 1,000 rounds into the radar site, the PT boat headed south, crossing the path of the Maddox. Behind it, two North Vietnamese boats in hot pursuit. The course of a war that had been simmering on America's back burner since the Eisenhower administration was about to turn red hot. The USS Maddox calibrated her guns and opened fire. The first naval battle between American and communist forces was a one-sided affair. The Americans suffered no casualties. The Vietnamese boats were sunk. Lyndon Johnson decided against further escalation, but his patience was wearing thin.
I want to leave an impression that we're going to be firm as hell without saying something that's dangerous. The people that are calling me up, they all feel that the Navy responded wonderfully, and that's good. But they want to be damn sure I don't pull them out and run, and they want to be damn sure that we're firm. We sure ought to always leave the impression that if you shoot at us, you're going to get hit.
The USS Maddox repositioned itself for a return to the edge of North Vietnamese waters, a move specifically designed to provoke a second attack. McNamara hurried to the Combat Command Center in the basement of the Pentagon. This was the hub that managed global crises involving the U.S. military. Closed to cameras, we have recreated the scene to bring the calls to life. It was here that McNamara huddled with senior military officers, going over target folders, a list of assets America would destroy if the North Vietnamese came out looking for another fight.
Yes?
Secretary McNamara on 90.
Yes?
Mr. President, we have pictures, analyses, numbers of sorties, bomb loadings, everything prepared for all of the target systems of North Vietnam. 70% of the petroleum supply of North Vietnam, we believe, is concentrated in 3 dumps, and we can bomb or strafe those dumps, destroy the petroleum system. In addition, there are certain prestige targets that we've been working on the last several months, and we have target folders prepared on those. For example, there is one bridge that is the key bridge on the rail line south out of Hanoi, and we could destroy that. And there are other prestige targets of that kind.
Okay.
Johnson and McNamara had initiated an unstoppable momentum for war. Out in the Gulf, a second destroyer, the Turner Joy, joined the Maddox, and a second carrier, the Constellation, was sent to reinforce the USS Ticonderoga, already on station. America now had ample force to execute the target folders prepared by McNamara. A full-scale engagement seemed inevitable. The next 24 hours would set the nation on a course that would lead it into the most divisive war in its history. It was a dirty night out in the Gulf.
Air contact, 125, bearing.
The crew of the Maddox and Turner Joy had been at battle stations for over 18 hours.
Six-pack fleet.
At the Pentagon, the military command center was on high alert. The chiefs were gathering and everyone was expecting trouble. The assumption was that the North Vietnamese would want revenge for the incident just 2 days earlier. The second attack, when it came, seemed inevitable, almost scripted. Sonar operators reported torpedoes in the water. The Turner Joy and Maddox opened fire, shooting into the pitch-dark night towards an enemy that appeared to dart across the radar screen. Overhead, pilots from the carriers were dropping flares, searching for the incoming enemy.
Hello?
Secretary McNamara, 90.
President, we just had word by telephone from Admiral Sharp that the destroyer is under torpedo attack.
What are these planes of ours doing around while they're being attacked?
The report is that they have observed, and we don't know by what means, whether this is radar or otherwise, I suspect it's radar, 2 unidentified vessels and 3 unidentified prop aircraft in the vicinity of the destroyers.
Okay.
It lasted 2 hours. Then, silence. Both destroyers reported no damage from the attack. At dawn, across the ocean, no debris, nothing to suggest there had ever even been an engagement. By now, the planes had returned to the carriers, and the pilots debriefed. No one reported actually seeing the enemy. The Maddox